The word cardio refers to the heart, the biological pump that circulates the blood. The word vascular refers to the extensive network of blood vessels that carries blood around the body. These structures form a transport system through which our blood delivers vital substances, such as oxygen, to our bodies and takes waste products, such as carbon dioxide, away for disposal. The heart is a hollow ball of muscle that sits slightly towards the left-hand side of the chest cavity, surrounded by the lungs. The heart is attached to the lungs by these large blood vessels. The pulmonary artery carries blood from the heart to the lungs. Blood returns from the lungs to the heart through the pulmonary veins. The other large vessel is the aorta. The heart is made up of 4 chambers: the left atrium, the left ventricle, the right ventricle, and the right atrium. This heart has been prepared to reveal the chambers from inside. The left atrium, the left ventricle, the right ventricle, and the right atrium. The left and right sides of the heart are separated by a thick muscular wall. On each side, the ventricle is separated from the atrium by a fibrous structure called a valve. As we'll see later, the valves ensure that blood travels in the right direction as it passes through the heart. Let's now look at how blood moves through the heart. This is the left side of the heart. Blood coming from the lungs flows through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. From there, it passes into the left ventricle, then out into the body through the aorta. Having come directly from the lungs, this blood is high in oxygen, which makes it appear bright red. Blood that returns from the body to the right side of the heart has had much of its oxygen removed, so it appears darker. For convenience, we'll show it in blue. Blood coming from the body passes through a large vein called the vena cava into the right atrium. Then it passes into the right ventricle and out through the pulmonary artery into the lungs, where its oxygen supply will be replenished. All of this blood flow is powered by the contraction of the walls of the atria and ventricles. Blood flows into the left and right atria. The atria contract, sending blood into the ventricles. Then the ventricles contract, forcing blood out of the heart. When the ventricles contract, the valves stop the blood from flowing back into the atria. Notice that the muscle in the ventricles are thicker on the left-hand side. This is because the left side has to pump blood to the whole body. The right side of the heart only has to pump the blood as far as the lungs. The blood that leaves the heart through the aorta passes through a network of arteries that constantly branch and get smaller as they travel to the tissues. In the tissues, they divide into extremely fine vessels known as capillaries. These are so thin that oxygen and nutrients such as glucose can diffuse through them into the tissues. Inside the cells, oxygen reacts with glucose to produce energy, plus carbon dioxide and water. This energy is the fuel for the chemical reactions that take place in our body. Basically, it's what keeps us alive. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, is harmful if it builds up in the body, so any excess needs to be returned to the bloodstream for removal via the lungs. Still within the tissues, the capillaries join up with each other to form veins. These join other veins, becoming larger as they return blood to the heart. Veins are shown in blue because they carry deoxygenated blood back towards the heart. Arteries are shown in red because they carry freshly oxygenated blood away from the heart to the tissues. The only exception to this color code occurs between the heart and the lungs. The pulmonary artery carries blood away from the heart and to the lungs. This blood is low in oxygen, so the artery is shown here in blue. The pulmonary veins carry blood from the lungs to the heart. This blood is high in oxygen, so the veins are shown here in red. Breathing. We hardly even know we're doing it. But it's the vital process that lets oxygen into our bodies and takes carbon dioxide out. The structures used in this process make up the respiratory system. When we breathe in, air enters our mouth or nose, or both, and passes to the back of the throat, an area known as the pharynx. Then it passes through the larynx and trachea into the lungs. Our oral cavity and pharynx receive food and liquids as well as air. To make sure that only air goes down our airways, the larynx closes up when we swallow. This is the opening of the human larynx, as seen through a special camera called an endoscope. The larynx is very sensitive to touch. When liquids or solids enter the pharynx, the structures of the larynx contract and move, blocking off the airway. The vocal cords also produce our voice by vibrating as air moves past them. Below the larynx is the trachea. This is a pipe made up of rings of cartilage with ligaments in between. The cartilage keeps the airway open, while the ligaments allow it to stretch and contract with the movements of the chest and neck. The trachea eventually divides into smaller airways called bronchi. The bronchi divide into even smaller airways that enter the tissue of the lung. Here, the openings of the smaller bronchi are seen in a cross-section of the lung. The tissue of the lung is soft and spongy. This allows it to inflate with air as we breathe in and deflate as we breathe out. Inside the lung, the small bronchi divide into tiny airways, known as bronchioles. Each bronchiole delivers air to a cluster of air sacs, known as alveoli. Each single alveolus is surrounded by a network of capillaries. In a process known as gas exchange, oxygen passes from the air into the blood, and carbon dioxide moves back the other way. The oxygen-rich blood travels back to the pulmonary vein. The carbon dioxide leaves the body as we breathe out. Our food supply provides us with many different nutrients that our tissues need to function. For these nutrients to get to our tissues, food needs to be broken down into molecules that are small enough to be carried around our bodies in the blood. This process is called digestion, and it's carried out by our digestive system. The main part of our digestive system is a long, continuous tube. The liver and pancreas add chemicals to this tube to help with the breakdown of food. Digestion begins in our mouths, where the physical process of chewing and the chemicals in our saliva begin to break down our food. When we swallow, the partially digested food passes into our esophagus. The esophagus runs through the chest cavity adjacent to the trachea. It is a relatively straight, fleshy tube. The wall of the esophagus consists of a muscular outer layer and an inner glandular layer. The inner layer produces mucus that lubricates the food. The muscular layer contracts in waves, pushing the food along. This propulsive form of muscle contraction is known as peristalsis. The esophagus pushes food into the stomach, a sac-like widening of the digestive tract that lies adjacent to the liver. The stomach has an outer muscular wall which contracts to churn and liquidize the food. The inner layer contains millions of glands that secrete mucus, plus hydrochloric acid and enzymes that further digest the food. This layer has many folds, which smooth out to some extent as the stomach fills. The folds are more exaggerated in this pig stomach than they would be in a human. This is how food looks after about 4 to 6 hours in the stomach. It has become a thin, soupy mixture known as chyme. At this stage, peristaltic contractions push the chyme through the pylorus, a narrow opening that leads to the duodenum, the beginning of the small intestine. Here, chyme mixes with enzymes secreted by the lining of the duodenum. Next to the duodenum is the pancreas. The pancreas is perhaps better known for producing insulin, a hormone that controls the absorption of glucose from the blood. But this fleshy gland also produces digestive enzymes that travel to the duodenum through the pancreatic duct. The liver also contributes to digestion by producing a liquid known as bile. Bile is stored in the gallbladder. From there, it travels through the bile duct into the duodenum. Inside the duodenum, bile acts like a detergent in that it helps to break down fat. The digestive juices produced by the pancreas, liver, and duodenum break down chyme into molecules that are small enough to pass through the walls of the intestine. This process continues throughout the rest of the small intestine as the muscular outer wall of the intestine pushes the chyme along. The whole small intestine is nearly 7 meters in length, but as well as being long, its inner surface is covered by millions of tiny projections called villi, giving it a total surface area equivalent to the size of a tennis court. This provides a huge area over which nutrients can pass through the intestine and into the bloodstream via capillaries that line the villi. This process is known as absorption. Fat molecules are absorbed into a vessel called a lacteal that later joins up with the circulatory system. Not all of our food is digested and absorbed. The remaining material passes into the large intestine, which includes the colon and the rectum. Here, excess water and salts are absorbed, and waste is stored until it is ready to be released through the anus. Before leaving the digestive system, we will briefly return to the liver. This is our largest internal organ. As well as its role in digestion, it has many other important functions. It helps to regulate our blood sugar levels by monitoring blood coming from the small intestine and storing or releasing glucose. It breaks down toxins, such as alcohol, and excretes them in the bile. And it processes waste products, such as ammonia. Ammonia is formed when our body uses protein for energy. Excess ammonia is toxic to our bodies, so the liver converts ammonia into a compound called urea. Urea is carried in the blood to the kidneys, where it is excreted from the body. Our excretory system is designed to get rid of waste products that are circulating in our blood. It's made up of the kidneys, 2 tubes called ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. Blood enters the kidneys through the renal artery, which branches off the aorta. This is the kidney in cross-section. Here we can see that the renal artery divides into smaller vessels that enter the tissue of the kidney. The outer brown section of the kidney is called the cortex. Inside the cortex there are about 1 million microscopic structures known as nephrons. Nephrons filter the blood in order to remove waste products and to adjust the levels of water and other substances in the body. Each nephron consists of a bundle of capillaries surrounded by a capsule, which is connected to a tubule. Blood flows through the capillaries under relatively high pressure. This forces water and various small molecules out into the capsule and on into the tubule. Some of the material that passes into the tubule is still needed by the body. This includes glucose, minerals, and much of the water. These substances are reabsorbed by capillaries that line the tubules. The amount that is reabsorbed depends on what the body needs at the time. The rest of the liquid continues along the tubule, along with waste products such as urea. This liquid, or urine, then passes into larger collecting ducts that drain into a central cavity called the pelvis of the kidney. From here, the urine travels down a tube called the ureter and into the bladder. Urine collects in the bladder until it is released through the urethra.